Hey, CJ here. So I've been playing Ghost of Tsushima for the past few days, and yeah, I'm loving it. Since everyone else is playing the game too, I thought this would be a great opportunity to get more people interested in the history of Asia by assessing this game's historical accuracy, and to justify my game time. So let's talk about the Mongols depicted in the game. What did the developers get right, what they got wrong, and the controversy they might be trying to bury. Obviously, there are going to be some spoilers, so that is your warning. For those of you unfamiliar with the game, here is a quick rundown. Ghost of Tsushima is set during the time of the first Mongol invasion of Japan, 1274. The players get to play as Sakai Jin, a samurai who's torn between following the path of honor or to abandon it to become a ghost, to exterminate the enemies invading his land, the Mongols, by any means necessary. Right off the bat, I have to say that they have done a terrific job dressing up the Mongols in this game. Let's look at the armor. Despite what many believed, the Mongols of that time period were not the fur-clad steppe people you often see in low-budget documentaries or old-timey movies. Many of them do wear heavy armors. Maybe not as fantasy-inspired as the one worn by Khotun Khan here, but in another part of the world, China, Genghis Khan and his army are inextricably linked to his heavy cavalry, Menggu Tieji, because historically, a significant portion of the Mongol cavalrymen were heavy lancers. With both the horse and riders clad in heavy armor, they wielded the hook lance, which they can use to pull their enemies off their horses. Some of the armors here are not specifically Mongol either. The one you see here, with the face scale covering, looks like it was inspired by the armor of the Qin Dynasty, the Jurchen-ruled dynasty in northern China that the Mongols conquered before invading Japan. It makes sense to see it here because the Mongols always try to incorporate the army of the people they conquered and use their expertise against their other enemies. Even the Mongols themselves would admit that they are less adept at taking mountain and water forts as the northern Chinese. As for the Muslim engineers, they make the best counterweight trebuchets. Many of these submitted people might not even have to be coerced to work for the Mongols, because they do reward administrators and warriors well, regardless of their background. It was common to see high-ranking Persians, Armenians, and even Korean and Chinese administrators and generals in their court. The Mongols practiced a brutal form of meritocracy that especially appealed to those with ambition and those who were neglected in the conquered societies. That's why the game had done a great job depicting the various Japanese collaborators who decided to work for them. In terms of gunpowder weaponry, I think some of you who are somewhat historically savvy would already know that the Mongols indeed brought grenade-like weapons to Japan. Archaeological discoveries had proven that these weapons existed, but how about the rocket-shooting hwachas? Hwachas are a Korean invention. It did exist, and it was featured on an episode of Mythbusters too. During that time, Goryeo Korea was a vassal of the Mongol Empire, who had to do all its bidding, so it is not strange that they could have acquired it from the Koreans, if they had it. The problem here is that this device was actually invented over 100 years after the setting of the game, so it is not supposed to be here. But gunpowder weaponry were actually quite regularly used in Song and Qing Dynasty China. Back before the Mongol Empire had even started, in the Song Dynasty book, Complete Essentials for the Military Classics, completed in 1044, the existence of various proto-gun weaponry were recorded, and there are lots of other weird and wonderful stuff there. In this time period, there is also the fire lance, which is practically a proto-cannon attached to the end of a lance, flamethrowers, and even land and sea mines, which they can actually use in the sequel. There are plenty more gunpowder weaponry in the Huolongjing, which compiled fire and gunpowder-based weaponry in China between 1280 to the middle of the 14th century. if the developers, Sucker Punch, isn't too fussed about historical accuracy, then they could stretch the timeline a bit and incorporate these weapons for the sequel. In terms of Mongol Tactics, obviously a lot of adjustments were made to make the game beatable for the players. But in a real fight in the open, there is just no way that Qin could have stood a chance fighting on foot. There is no reason for the Mongols to even get off their horses to fight Qin. The light cavalrymen would have just used their horses' superior mobility to keep their distance while puncturing him with their arrows. This is just their standard war tactics. And if Qin started pursuing, then they would feign retreat before their heavy lancers charge in. They have lived on the back of their horses for most of their life. Why would they not use all the advantage they could get? Maybe Sucker Punch could improve on the horse combat system for the sequel. In some parts of the game, Qin had to do a bit of sneaking, and if you have alerted a group of Mongols, only those within shouting distance will be alerted. This sounds reasonable, right? But no, not for the Mongols, because they had whistling arrows, which, if shot into the air, it would create a loud whistling noise that they could use to signal their allies from much further away. So they could have alerted the whole camp. The Japanese also had their own version of the whistling arrow, so this device should have been quite commonly available. While we are on the topic of arrows, the Mongols were also known to have used poison arrows. However, this account seemed to be unique to Japanese sources and not found anywhere else. So the game's developer actually did a very clever thing with this. They took a bit of creative license and presented it as if they had learned about the use of poison arrows in Japan, and it became a defining moment in the story. I'm not going to spoil the story for those of you who haven't played the game, but the idea that they learned the use of poison arrows in Japan is not completely ridiculous. In general, Sucker Punch had done a pretty good job on the little things, but what went off the mark are some of the biggest factual errors they could have ever made. Later in the game, you will encounter a heavy snow terrain in the northern part of the island. This is quite absurd because the island of Tsushima is actually quite small in real life, and its latitude is roughly the same as Los Angeles. Combined with the fact that it is a coastal area and the mountains aren't that high, it is impossible to have snow and thick ice sheets over the lake like these. The other thing that they got completely wrong is the defeat of the Mongols. They were not defeated at Tsushima and prevented to reach the mainland. In fact, the opposite happened. They easily defeated the resistance there and secured the island within a week, before moving on to conquer the next island on the chain, Iki. The real large-scale battle actually took place in Hakata Bay in the island of Kyushu, just next to the main island of Honshu. This is where they fought the Battle of Bun'e and were made to retreat back to Korea in the aftermath. And now I'm going to talk about the most interesting change Sucker Punch made. They have made the invading Mongol force uniformly Mongol. This is highly inaccurate because historically, during the first Mongol invasion, only about 5,000 of the 20 to 30,000 invading troops were Mongols. The majority were actually made up of Koreans, Chinese, and Jurchens. But I can easily guess the reason why Sucker Punch might have left them out. The simplest reason might be because they are just too lazy to program more enemy types, and adding many other different factions may make the story too confusing. But the other reason, which is more likely in my opinion, is because they wanted to avoid controversy. Yeah, because this old topic has been quite controversial in Asia for a long time. Even how they named the invasion in Japan is a matter of contention too. Originally, this invasion was called the Mongol Invasion, or Invasion of Foreign Bandits. But in the Edo period, after Japan imported lots of Chinese history books and read up on the history from the other side, the name of the invasion changed to Genko, which means Yuan Raiders. Yuan comes from the Yuan dynasty, which is the Mongol-ruled Chinese dynasty. This term was first used in the book Dai Nihonshi, commissioned by Tokugawa Mitsukuni an early nationalist who believed that Japan was the perfect exemplar nation. But since China considered Kubilai's Yuan dynasty to be a legitimate Chinese dynasty, in essence, this name change acknowledges that the Mongol invasion of Japan was also a Chinese invasion of Japan. Later on, this interpretation became a somewhat convenient propaganda fodder around the time of the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1892, shortly before the war, a military song with the same name, Genko, was composed, and it became tremendously popular. It stoked the population's imagination that the war is a form of payback for the Mongol invasion. Due to the controversial nature of the term, nowadays the term Genko is starting to see less use. Even in the Japanese product page of Ghost of Tsushima, you cannot find the term Genko anywhere. So yeah, that's why I think this is a deliberate choice to not include any of the other ethnicities, and it is unlikely that they will fix this historical inaccuracy in the sequel. Anyway, if you have found these historical tidbits to be interesting, give it a thumbs up and subscribe, because we release a video on this channel every week. Until next time, stay cool, my bros!